France, 1942. The air was thick with fear, heavy with the sound of German boots echoing through the narrow streets of Lyon. Curfews had emptied the city of laughter, and even whispers could cost a life. Inside a dimly lit apartment, a single candle fought against the darkness. Its flame trembled as if it too knew the danger of being seen. Behind that fragile light sat Clara Hensley, a British nurse hiding in plain sight under forged papers, her hands trembling as she stitched a torn bandage. Each night was a test of nerve, each breath a silent prayer that the next knock wouldn't be the Gestapo. When the knock finally came, it wasn't loud, but it made her heart stop. Clara froze, listening. The footsteps outside shifted. Then a man's voice announced a delivery. "Medical supplies?" She hesitated only a moment before unlatching the door. The German courier's shadow stretched across her floor as he handed over the crate. His eyes lingered longer than they should have. She forced a polite nod, signed the false receipt, and shut the door the instant he turned away. The lock clicked, and only then did she exhale. Kneeling beside the crate, Clara began unpacking. Morphine, bandages, antiseptic, all ordinary enough. But as her fingers brushed one roll of bandages, something felt wrong. The fabric was too stiff, too heavy. She frowned, unwrapping it carefully. Halfway through, something small slipped out and landed softly on the floor. A folded piece of parchment. Her heart quickened. She lifted it with trembling hands and brought it closer to the candlelight. The edges were singed, the writing faint, hurried, desperate, captured near Amiens. Name Flight Lieutenant Carter. Injured, being moved east. Please, help us. The words blurred as her eyes filled with tears. For weeks, she had treated soldiers and refugees, doing what she could within the limits of her cover. But this was different. Someone had reached out to her directly. Someone alive, terrified, and depending on her. She could almost hear his voice through the page. She folded the letter again, pressing it to her chest as she listened to the muffled rhythm of boots in the street below. Every instinct told her to burn it, to stay invisible. But her conscience burned hotter than her fear. The candle flickered, throwing restless shadows across the room. In that wavering light, Clara's face hardened with resolve. She had seen too much suffering to look away now. Somewhere out there, Allied prisoners were being moved through enemy territory, injured, starved, and forgotten. If this letter had reached her, it meant there were others like her, people passing messages, forming links in a chain of quiet defiance. She didn't yet know their names or faces, only that a network existed somewhere beneath the surface of this occupied world. She took a deep breath and whispered, "If they're alive, I'll find them." Outside, the wind howled through the broken shutters. The candle flared, then went out, leaving her in darkness. Somewhere beyond those walls, men and women risked everything to save strangers they'd never meet. And in that moment, Clara Hensley, the nurse with trembling hands, became part of something far greater than herself. The war, for her, would no longer be about survival. It would be about defiance, compassion, and a promise that could cost her everything. The letter that had slipped from a roll of bandages was more than a plea for help. It was a spark. And before the night was over, that spark would ignite one of the most daring rescue networks of the entire war. The war had many fronts. Some fought with rifles, others with silence. Beneath the occupied cities of Europe, where Nazi flags fluttered above terrified crowds, an invisible army was forming. They carried no weapons, wore no uniforms, and their names were rarely remembered. Yet they were among the most dangerous enemies the Reich ever faced. This was the hidden world of the Comet Line, a web of courage spun by women who refused to surrender. It began with whispers in back rooms and stolen glances in train stations. Women like André de Jong, a young Belgian nurse barely in her 20s, moved through occupied streets as if she belonged to the silence itself. She carried false papers, rosary beads, and a mind trained to remember faces and routes instead of maps. To the enemy, she was harmless. To the Allied prisoners of war, she was salvation. André's eyes rarely betrayed fear, though every knock at the door could mean capture. Her home, like many others, had become both sanctuary and trap, Across the channel, another name echoed through the underground, Odette Sansom, a mother who had left her children in England to serve the Special Operations Executive. She operated deep inside France, posing as a courier. Her courage wasn't loud, it was meticulous. Every forged document, every coded message sewn into her coat lining, carried a heartbeat of defiance. One wrong word, one unfamiliar face, and she could vanish into the black maw of the Gestapo's prisons. Still she persisted. "We do not choose when to be brave," she once said. "We only choose whether to be." And then there was Virginia Hall, the American with a wooden leg, whom the Germans called the most dangerous of all Allied spies. She disguised herself as an aging milkmaid, shuffling through villages no one would suspect held secrets. Her radio crackled with coded transmissions that fed life into the network. Escape routes, safe houses, lists of POWs still waiting in the dark. The Gestapo plastered her face across walls, calling her La Dame qui boite, the limping lady. But by the time they closed in, she had already moved, vanishing like smoke. Together, these women formed the backbone of an empire of shadows. The Comet Line, Pat O'Leary Line, and others like them stretched from Brussels to the Pyrenees, where POWs were smuggled through mountain passes into neutral Spain. Civilians hid soldiers beneath barns and in wine cellars. Nuns carried coded notes inside hymn books. Laundresses hung white sheets on windowsills to signal a safe passage. Even church bells carried meaning. A single long toll meant danger. 2 short rings meant clear skies ahead. Every act of kindness was an act of war. Clara Hensley, still new to this hidden world, was drawn in slowly. The letter she had received had been her entry point. Now she worked under false identity as a field nurse by day, and by night she became part of something greater, helping to move wounded airmen from one safe house to another. In the candlelit cellar beneath a church, she met others, teachers, shopkeepers, widows, ordinary women turned silent soldiers. Maps were drawn in dust, then wiped clean. Names were never spoken twice. Tension clung to every breath. The Gestapo's presence was everywhere. Posters on walls, raids at dawn, informants who traded lives for rations. Betrayal was not a question of if, but when. André once said, "We trusted only the eyes, not the words." The women learned to read fear in a flicker of hesitation, to sense deceit in the way someone folded their hands. Sometimes their instincts saved them. Other times they didn't. One winter night, Clara and 2 others guided a wounded pilot through the outskirts of Paris. They traveled by moonlight, through frost and silence, avoiding roads where German convoys prowled. When they reached a farmhouse safe house, the old woman who opened the door did not smile. Her hands trembled too much. Clara's pulse quickened. Had they been followed? Inside, the air smelled of kerosene and damp straw. Her child's toy lay abandoned near the door, a warning placed there hours earlier to signal danger. Clara caught André's gaze across the room, and without a word, they turned back into the night, vanishing into the mist before the German trucks arrived. That was how the network survived, not with luck, but with intuition sharpened by fear. Every route was redrawn after each escape. Every safe house burned was replaced by 2 more. Their lives became a blur of code names, train whistles, and prayers whispered to a God who might no longer be listening. And yet they continued, because every face they saved the pale. Half-starved men clutching forged papers, whispering "thank you" before vanishing into the mountains, reminded them why they could not stop. The war raged on above them, loud and brutal. But beneath the surface, in the quiet corridors of occupied Europe, a silent battle was being fought by women whose names history nearly forgot. And as the shadows deepened, the Gestapo's grip tightened. The network was growing, but so was the danger. Somewhere among them, betrayal was already taking root. The women didn't know it yet, but the next letter, the next knock on the door, would change everything again. Night came early in occupied France, and with it, the kind of silence that made hearts race. In a small village outside Paris, Odette Sansom walked the narrow cobblestone streets with a basket on her arm and forged papers tucked beneath her sleeve. To anyone watching, she was just another widow running errands before curfew. But inside that basket, beneath the loaf of bread and bundle of cloth, were coded photographs, maps, and instructions for Allied pilots hidden in safe houses across the countryside. Odette had once been a mother first, the kind who pressed warm hands to fevered brows and read bedtime stories until her voice faded. But when war consumed Europe, she became something else entirely, a ghost with a purpose. Her 3 daughters were safe in England, far beyond the reach of German patrols. She carried their memory like a hidden wound, one she couldn't afford to touch too often. "It's easier not to feel," she once whispered to a fellow agent, "when you're already living a lie." Her life had become a pattern of deception, smiling at Nazi officers in cafes, pretending not to understand their language, while beneath the floorboards of her rented home, 2 escaped airmen struggled to stay silent. She cooked for them at night, dividing her rations, and prayed quietly before dawn. The sound of boots outside always froze her mid-breath. Every morning could be her last. But she told herself that fear was a luxury, one she couldn't afford. The resistance relied on her calm. She carried messages, coordinated drops, and passed along names using invisible ink. Sometimes she met André or Clara in abandoned barns, exchanging codes disguised as prayers. "The fields are clear" might mean the roads were safe. "The harvest is thin" meant the Gestapo had begun another sweep. Words had become lifelines, and silence its own form of survival. But no amount of planning could keep fate from finding them. It happened one damp afternoon in 1943. Odette and her companion, a fellow agent named Peter Churchill, were traveling under false identities, husband and wife, on their way to meet a new contact in Annecy. The cafe where they stopped was nearly empty, save for a few locals and a pair of German officers drinking wine near the window. The air smelled faintly of smoke and fear. Odette kept her eyes low, tracing the rim of her cup, while Peter read a newspaper, pretending not to notice the soldiers. Then came the mistake. A woman approached their table, too nervous, too eager. She whispered a name, one Odette didn't recognize, and in that instant she knew. The contact was compromised. The Gestapo had found them. She and Peter stood up slowly, walking toward the door as if nothing had happened. Outside, the street seemed too quiet. Then came the shout, "Halt!" The soldiers burst from the cafe. Peter pushed her forward, yelling for her to run. She turned just in time to see him tackled to the ground. For a heartbeat she hesitated. The safe route was clear. The alleyway led to a waiting car. If she left now, she could escape, deliver the documents, save dozens more lives. But she couldn't move. Odette's hands shook as she watched the soldiers drag Peter to his knees. One of them struck him across the face, demanding names, locations. He met her eyes for just a moment, a silent plea not for help, but for her to flee. She turned away, then stopped. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I can't." She dropped her basket, its contents scattering into the street, and stepped back toward him. The officer's pistol leveled at her chest. "Name," he barked. She said nothing. He grabbed her arm, twisting it hard enough to make her gasp. Still, she didn't speak. They were taken together. The papers, the photos, the codes, all gone. As the car door slammed behind her, Odette stared through the glass at the receding street, at the basket lying overturned in the gutter. Inside, the loaf of bread had split open, revealing the hollow space where a message had been hidden. She prayed the courier would find it before the Germans did. The ride to the prison was long and silent. Peter's head rested against the window, blood trickling down his cheek. Odette sat beside him, her wrists bound, but her gaze steady. She didn't regret her choice. In her mind, she heard her daughter's voices, distant, fading. And then André's words, "We trusted only the eyes, not the words." The car jolted to a stop outside a stone fortress. As the soldiers dragged her out, Odette thought not of fear, but of defiance. If they wanted her body, they could take it. Her soul, her secrets, those would never belong to them. That night, as she was locked in a cell, she pressed her fingers to the wall and whispered a single promise into the dark. "They will not break me, Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, washing the streets clean of her footprints. The network didn't yet know she was gone. For now, her absence was just another silence among many. But soon, that silence would echo across the resistance. The shadows were shifting, and the cost of bravery was about to rise. The morning it happened, the air over Lyon felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of silence that came before catastrophe. Clara Hensley sat by the window of a safe house, watching smoke curl above the rooftops in the distance. Somewhere out there, one of their own had been caught. Word had spread like wildfire through the underground. The courier was taken. And worse, he was talking. For days, the network had trusted him to carry false passports and coded notes sewn into the hems of jackets. He had smiled easily, laughed loudly, and swore he'd rather die than betray them. But no one truly knew what happened inside a Gestapo interrogation room. No one could withstand everything. Under the weight of pain and fear, even the strongest hearts cracked, and when his did, names spilled out. By dusk, the first raids began. The Comet Line's carefully woven web began to unravel, strand by strand. A farmhouse near Lille was set ablaze, its cellar still hiding the remnants of a radio transmitter. In Brussels, 2 women were dragged from a church confessional, accused of harboring pilots. Clara heard the news whispered in code over the static of their dying transmitter, her heart sinking as familiar names turned to ghost stories. She moved through the city that night in disguise, her hair hidden beneath a cap, her nurse's uniform traded for a factory worker's coat. Each step was a risk. The Gestapo had lists now, addresses, aliases, descriptions. The faces that once belonged to friends were now faces that could get her killed. She reached the next safe house only to find it ransacked, furniture overturned, papers scattered, the smell of smoke still lingering. She knelt beside the hearth, finding the half-burnt remains of a forged passport. The name on it was Odette Sansom. Odette had been captured days earlier, but Clara refused to believe it until now. The sight of the scorched document hit her harder than any bullet could. She pressed it to her chest, the edges still warm, and closed her eyes. "Not her," she whispered. "Please, not her." The network was collapsing. Coded radios were smashed with hammers, messages burned to ash. They shaved their heads and bound their chests to pass as men, slipping across checkpoints under false identities. Clara took to the roads again, guiding what few she could, 2 wounded pilots and a teenage boy who had lost his entire family, to a barn outside Dijon. Every shadow seemed alive, every echo a footstep in pursuit. The Gestapo were everywhere now. Their posters, plastered across walls, showed crude sketches of faces, one of them her own. Wanted for espionage and aiding fugitives. The price on her head was more than she could fathom. Yet what haunted her wasn't the fear of capture, it was the guilt. Each name betrayed meant another family torn apart, another home raided, another woman dragged into the night. One evening she hid in a half-collapsed monastery on the outskirts of town. The air inside smelled of dust and decay, the crucifix above the altar blackened by smoke. She found a candle stub and lit it, the flame weak and uncertain, like her resolve. For a moment, she let herself feel it, the exhaustion, the despair. The walls whispered the names of the fallen, André, perhaps dead in Belgium, Odette, lost to the prisons, and the countless others who would never be known. Still, she couldn't stop. The network had always been about more than survival. It was about defiance, about proving that courage could exist even in the darkest places. But now, that courage came with unbearable cost. Outside, the night was alive with the distant rumble of trucks. Clara pressed herself to the cold stone wall, heart pounding. A convoy was passing through, searchlights sweeping the empty road. She clutched a forged passport in her hand, one she had made hours before. Her last. The ink hadn't even dried. When the trucks passed, she stepped out into the open road, wind biting at her face. Behind her, the safe house she'd once used stood in flames, its roof collapsing inward. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to save there, only ghosts and ashes. Each mile forward felt heavier. The weight of every decision, every life risked, pressed on her shoulders. For every man she had helped escape, a woman had been taken. For every coded message sent, another name was lost to betrayal. By dawn, Clara reached a crossroads, a literal and moral one. She could keep running south towards Spain, where safety still lingered across the Pyrenees. Or she could turn back, find what remained of the network and rebuild it from the ruins. Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small scrap of paper she had saved from the beginning, the letter that had started everything. The ink had faded, but the words still burned in her memory. "Please, help us." She looked toward the mountains, then back toward the smoke rising over the horizon. Her breath caught in her throat, and she made her choice. Clara turned away from freedom and walked back toward the fire. Because even in betrayal, even as the shadows closed in, she refused to let the silence win. The cell was smaller than a hospital closet, stone walls slick with damp, a single bulb swaying overhead. Clara Hensley sat on the cold floor, her wrists bound, her lips cracked from thirst. The Gestapo had stopped asking questions hours ago. Now they only watched. The silence between beatings was worse than the pain itself, because in that silence she could hear her own thoughts, could feel the faces of those she'd helped slip across borders, the whispered goodbyes under moonlight, the promises she might never keep. Across the continent, in Ravensbrück, Odette Sansom's world had narrowed to the smell of ash and the sound of boots. She no longer counted the days. They blended into a haze of smoke, hunger, and the unending roll call. Her hands trembled as she carried stones for a wall that would never be finished. Yet when a guard shouted her name, she stood taller. They could take everything, her health, her freedom, her humanity, but not her defiance. At night, Odette would close her eyes and see the faces of the men she'd helped escape. Young pilots, barely more than boys, shivering under her coat as she led them through the woods. In her dreams, they reached Spain, sunlight spilling over the mountains. She never saw what happened next. She didn't need to. Knowing they had lived was enough. Clara's captors believed that breaking her would dismantle the remnants of the network. They offered her food in exchange for names, warmth for information. She refused them all. The officer who questioned her, a man with cold, precise eyes, once leaned close and whispered, "Do you think your courage will save you?" Clara met his stare and, in a voice barely audible, said, "It already has." In the darkness, she hummed the coded tune they once used to signal safety. A lullaby now turned into a quiet rebellion. Each note was a reminder of what they'd built, of the women who had carried bread in one hand and forged papers in the other, who had hidden soldiers beneath their floorboards and hope beneath their fear. Odette's body began to fail, but her spirit did not. One evening, as the women around her collapsed from exhaustion, she whispered to a fellow prisoner, "They can break my body, but they'll never have my soul." The words traveled through the barracks like a spark, tiny, unseen but impossible to extinguish. As Clara lay in her cell, barely conscious, a vision came to her. Snow-covered hills, footprints vanishing into the distance, and the laughter of those she'd helped escape. They were free. That thought alone warmed her in the cold. She smiled faintly, her lips forming the shape of a prayer she no longer had the strength to speak. The war was still raging outside those walls, but within them, something far greater endured. These women, nurses, couriers, mothers, spies, had done what armies could not. They had kept the flame of humanity alive in a world consumed by darkness. When the guards came for Clara the next morning, she did not look afraid. She lifted her chin, meeting their gaze, her silence louder than any confession. And somewhere beyond those walls, beyond the camps and the cells, a single radio crackled to life. A message crossed the channel, an Allied pilot reporting safe arrival. The network had survived. Their names would be forgotten by history for a time, but their courage would never fade. In the deepest night of war, the women of the shadows had become the light. The war's end came not with cheers for everyone, but with a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. When the camps were liberated and the prison doors creaked open, Clara stumbled into the daylight like a ghost returning from another world. Her body was frail, her sight dimmed by malnutrition, but her will remained unbroken. The sky above France was wide and impossibly blue, a color she hadn't seen in years. She wept not for herself, but for those who never walked out beside her. Odette Sansom was found alive among the survivors of Ravensbrück, her hair cropped short, her uniform in tatters. She was awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian honor for bravery. When they pinned the medal to her chest, she stood silently, the weight of the metal feeling cold against her skin. "I am no hero," she told the reporters who crowded around her. "The heroes are the ones who did not come back." Her voice was calm, almost tender, but it carried the grief of 1,000 souls. Across Europe, trains returned POWs to their homes. Families reunited. Children ran through the streets, clutching the hands of fathers they thought were dead. Yet in quiet corners of hospitals and countryside cottages, the women who had made those reunions possible sat alone. Clara found work again as a nurse, though her hands still trembled when she touched a patient's bandages. Some nights she woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall, certain the Gestapo had come again. The world moved on quickly. The newspapers printed stories of generals and treaties, of nations rebuilt. The names of the women who had risked everything, the ones who smuggled pilots through forests, who carried secrets in loaves of bread, were rarely mentioned. History had turned the page, but those they saved never forgot. Letters arrived from former prisoners, written in shaky hands. "You gave me my life back. I owe every sunrise to you." Clara kept those letters in a small wooden box beside her bed. Odette visited the graves of her fallen comrades each year, laying wildflowers on the soil and whispering their names so they wouldn't fade from memory. They had lived through hell, and still they chose compassion. Freedom, they knew, had never been free. It had been paid for in silence, in sacrifice, and in the unspoken courage of women who had once lived in the shadows. Decades passed, and the dust of war settled into history books. The names of generals filled the pages, but somewhere beneath the grand victories and political treaties, the quieter stories began to surface. Letters discovered in attics, faded photographs tucked into forgotten drawers, medals long left unclaimed. Among them was a single, fragile envelope sealed with age. Inside, a coded message written in careful, trembling ink, the letter that had once changed everything. Archivists found it in a box labeled medical supplies. 1942. Beneath the creased paper was a note from Clara Hensley, British Red Cross. The letter was preserved in a museum years later, displayed under soft light, its faded words now a testament to the courage that had once lived in the shadows. Visitors would pause before it, reading the translation, and wonder what it had taken for a woman under Nazi occupation to write such words of defiance and hope. Old film reels played beside it, grainy footage of Odette Sansom smiling faintly at a medal ceremony, refusing to call herself a hero. A black and white photograph of Virginia Hall, leaning on her wooden prosthetic leg, the woman the Germans once called the most dangerous spy in Europe. André de Jong, older now, standing in front of a classroom of children, teaching them that courage was not born from hate, but from love. Former POWs began to speak, their voices trembling with age but strong with gratitude. They described the women who had led them through forests under the cover of night, who had shared their last crust of bread, who had whispered, "You must live for all of us." Many of those men had spent their lives telling the world that they had not survived because of luck, but because of the women who refused to let them die forgotten. The camera lingers on their faces in old photographs, women laughing despite the danger, their eyes bright with something stronger than fear. Maps with coded routes, hand-drawn symbols, and tiny crosses marking safe houses appear on the screen. Each mark a promise kept, each one a story untold. The narrator's voice returns, calm and reverent. They fought without guns, without glory, but with unbreakable courage. They carried no banners, but they carried freedom on their backs. Theirs is not a forgotten story. It is the quiet heartbeat of freedom itself. The final image fades in, Clara's letter beneath glass, the ink faded but still legible. The words glimmer faintly under the light, as if alive once more. Outside the museum window, sunlight filters through, warm and golden, falling gently over the display. The world has changed, but their courage remains, echoing through time, reminding us that sometimes the bravest battles are fought in silence.